So anyway, back to
I'd like to welcome you all back to the debate. like to invite the member of government to open the closing half of the debate.
The opening opposition makes the biggest mistake. They first try to perpetuate this narrative that China is going to trample the regional interests of ASEAN. And what happens is turning to the UN and US, who's going to remain silent in the status quo, is going to solve it. Furthermore, they don't seem to understand that ASEAN can only legitimately tackle China if it tries to get autonomy within its own region and to actually empower itself. We think there's a big contradiction within the opposition case. What am I bringing to you today? First, I'm going to talk about how this motion causes regional empowerment. So internally, we think there's a lot of problems with ASEAN in terms of internal agreement. We think what happens is having peacekeeping courses brings this debate to a new direction by understanding there will be regional benefits, there will be less violence, more cooperation, not just on economic issues, but on military security issues. We think what happens is, as the first government talked about, ASEAN can get together security-wise and get over their border conflicts by looking at China and characterizing that as the big common enemy they need to fight. Second, I'm going to talk about how do you actually counter China hedge. So I think the opening opposition trying to get away with is that China will win in a war with ASEAN, which we don't agree with. And it says that China getting together with ASEAN itself should not actually occur, and China won't trample on regional interests. Before I do that, 3 points of constructive rebuttal. So first, they hinge a lot of their case upon how this is illegal because the UN said it's illegal because peacekeeping forces exist. But then go to talk about African Union and the Arab League that do this anyway, and there's like not a huge amount of illegality to it. But most importantly, illegality is kind of bullshit, right? Like in the world of like anarchy, states don't have like a higher presence God to tell them what they can or cannot do. And China has continuously trampled on what the UN or the US do. China has signed a human rights like doctrine, but never followed any of it. China has continuously done terrible things inside Tibet, even though the UN unanimously votes, like 197-3, for China to stop doing the oppressive activities in Tibet. China won't listen to legality, so if it's just hinging your hat on legality when a state is not bound by those state laws, it's tying ASEAN to a boat that's sinking that will soon die. Most importantly, we'd also tell you what happens is their largest characterization of this policy is that an arms race is wrong. What is worse than the comparative is letting China trample ASEAN countries, not letting them have any ability to fight for their own regional ability, and to do what ASEAN is in the status quo, which is appeasement, which is saying, we'll give you more free trade, we'll help you more China, please, we're an important regional economic interest to you. Which is exactly the wrong type of policy when like it didn't work on Hitler, and he just promoted more and more, which is what we think happens in the status quo. Now, 2 points of constructive matter. How does this motion cause regional empowerment? Which we think is pertinent to the front half debate, which is talking about how does this empower ASEAN, but also pertinent for empowerment for other reasons. So first is most importantly, the first most important mechanism we believe is peacekeeping forces themselves. We think what happens is when you draw everyone into one body, which promotes the idea of a region that fights for its peace and its stability. It transcends the idea that people are just separate countries without any connectivity at all, but creates an implicit understanding that the region has a level of peace it needs to have, has a level of values it wants to protect if some dictator or some conflict is getting out of hand, or also to stop regional instability, which is really important. So what happens is, we think good examples of this is like NATO, when a lot of countries that work together were put together under a more like kind of a regional pact, and then Western Europe understood that its common security umbrella were together, that they were in one boat together, which drew them much closer. A lot of international scholars are like, NATO's the reason why the EU was formed. They started forming this common identity within security issues. But there are also practical implications of this, right? For instance, a lot of people understand that violence within Thailand is unproductive and hurts the current trade, its international trade, and also hurts people as like violence is spilling over and the problems of economics are like spilling over as well. An ASEAN peacekeeping force could come there, bring peace to the entire region, and force two opposition groups to come to the table and actually start agreeing on certain things, which actually brings the region to more empowerment. This is a priori good, as we believe, and because political discussions cannot occur as long as there's political developments like violence occurring, because each side is saying like, hey, we can't do something because there's no ceasefire or else you're going to get an advantage. That's why ceasefires are vitally important for like political discussions. But this is more important than just like Thailand. This is important for things like Vietnam and Thailand, with border disputes. Things like Khmer Rouge and the former border dispute between that, Laos, Vietnam, and Thailand, who say that we all have different disagreements. This is for things like Indonesia and West Timor, who still have disputes when violence occurs. We think peacekeeping forces could draw down those issues and force those diplomatic cables, which means more regional stability, which is an a priori good, we think, because what happens is there's less infighting, there's less actual people dying, there's less people being affected by bad negative economic impacts. But bringing this into what we think the front has talked about, what happens is, we think even discussing using force is good. Because what happens is, when you're forced to go to the political dialogue of how we're going to use our forces or when, it forces countries to say what's the best interest of Southeast Asia. What is the Southeast Asian values of what we actually care about. Which is why the Arab League is good. The Arab League, when they talk about how bad it is, has no teeth. Which is why Syria is blowing up, but Saudi Arabia is constantly asking the United States to intervene, or UN to intervene, but no one's been able to do anything. So this is harm that we think the Open House needs to deal with. Most importantly, we think how to counter China hedge. Before I do that, I'm sorry, take my time.
So why is fighting and losing a war with China worse than letting them have an
Okay, so like I just flagged that my second contention is how to counter China hedge. And I also told you that they won't lose a war. Why do we believe that? Because what happens is, when you have ASEAN become a combined region, which is what anything in my belief this motion does, like stop infighting, what happens is you create an idea of encirclement across China. China is not willing to fight a war with only Vietnam. It's willing to bully only one country. What happens is when ASEAN pulls together and says, we're together with this, essentially the entire southern border of China is together, which means that what happens is they have to deal with all the borderlands of other people. They also have to deal with Japan and the United States, which means they have a double flank war on two sides. You pull India into the conflict, which would likely be because of the United States, then that's 3 times. China is not willing to engage in a military conflict if it knows it'll pull in other places which have interests. So we think what happens is the policy of encirclement is good. But most importantly, we think ASEAN can start speaking about political issues that are not part of the economic issues. They need regional cohesion, because China's strategy is to sweet talk with economics some countries and split the region apart. It is much harder to handle for China to fight an entire region. It is much harder for China to claim legitimacy in a war if it is fighting 15 different countries. It is much harder for China to say that it owns the South China Sea if 15 countries say we all need to trade there and we all should co-own it. We believe that China can bully one country, which is what it's doing right now, bullying Japan out, bullying Korea out, bullying Vietnam, Vietnamese out. But we don't think it's much easy. We don't think it's easy for China to say we're going to bully out the entire region before the regional instability. So ultimately, we think peacekeeping leads to more information sharing, troop coordination, technology sharing, also leads to specialization within the military, which means the region itself can stand against China and finally gain autonomy. For these reasons, we're very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the member of government to indicate on government side. I'd like to invite the member of opposition, please. We're here.
Ladies and gentlemen, on side closing opposition, we have a few questions to ask, and we believe that closing opposition will take this debate regardlessly of what those answers to these questions are. The first question is, so at the end of the day, will China really support or back down at the end of the day? Right? But we say that regardlessly, because ASEAN is going to lose out the vital support that comes from China, both economically and also in other aspects, ASEAN is going to lose out. But secondly, also on this opening card, right? So whether diplomatic measures are better or military measures are better, we say again, regardless of which measures gain success at the end of the day, those side effects of that military measure already make it an undesirable choice to start with. But more importantly, what closing opposition is going to bring to you is first, how you will lose support from China. Second, how this ambiguous conditions of what peacekeeping is would actually make ASEAN a lot more unstable. But lastly, how you are making a logical leap from an economic union to a military union, and why skipping the political process is so important. And that directly clashes with what Daryl said in the very beginning, right? But before that, just a few rebuttals to what closing government said. So closing government first came out and said that yes, we want regional stability. And that is the question that we have for the entire debate till now. So exactly what do you mean by peace? we see that peace is actually a very relative concept, right? A lot of countries have a lot of small conflicts that are ongoing. So these conflicts are always there, such as between Vietnam and Cambodia, and between a lot of different ASEAN countries, and between ASEAN countries and other countries, but they don't really have that big of an impact. And more or less, they stay in a semi-conflict situation, which we believe are a lot better than what opening government is trying to do here, but escalating it into a real conflict in itself. So, not now. But next, on this idea on how they say that we want an encirclement of 15 countries between China. What they've ignored is that these are 15 small countries. And China, we don't really care. Lastly, on this idea on how they say that we have to force ASEAN to come up with a consensus, and we want them to have discussion on all other kinds of aspects and not just on economic aspects. The problem with that is you're making a logical leap already here. We see that firstly, there are lots of members who have not that mature to start with. Members such as Myanmar, who just came out of a more diplomatic process and who just started to become a more mature member of ASEAN. But second, that there isn't a consensus right now in ASEAN. Without a consensus and without a mature political mechanism, making that leap and making the consensus right away and making actions based on the consensus is going to be very disastrous. Now, coming down to extensions and the rest of our responses integrated in it. So firstly, we say that very likely, as what opening opposition has said, China wouldn't back down. We see no examples of China backing down before. But what opening governments responded by is that, right? Even if China doesn't back down, it would be very likely that China wouldn't be less of that hard case on these issues, right? But we said what is going to happen is that regardless of they back down or not, very likely, and that's what China always does, China will keep that into a very muddy condition, right? So that's what China do with Japan, China do with a lot of islands, that is, on one hand they claim that these belong to China, but on the second hand they don't want any kind of escalation, believe that they're prolonged. But what is going to happen with this policy is that China will see that ASEAN is trying to make themselves a bigger potential threat, and China wants to do something afterwards, right? So what is China going to do? And that's what we come to the debate, right? So we say that China's always been supporting ASEAN a lot. We see cases such as the ASEAN-China Free Trade Area in 2010, or the ASEAN Plus Free Macroeconomic and Research Office. We see that China is pumping a lot of investment into ASEAN because China also wants to be part of the ASEAN support, right? That is because China sees these conflicts as conflicts between them and various independent countries, but not with ASEAN in itself. So they still want a friendly relationship with ASEAN in itself. But as what Darren said, now we don't want that friendship to start with. What China is going to do is that carrot and stick approach, right? If you don't want that carrot, we're going to give it the stick. So what is likely happening is that China on one hand are not going to withdraw, they're going to keep that in a muddy condition. But on the other hand, China will try to impose stricter conditions on all these kind of free trade areas and free trade agreements, and all those countries will lose in the economic aspect without gaining anything in terms of territorial aspect. Before I go continue, Daryl.
China just wants that relationship with Singapore and Malaysia, and it has no respect for nations which it considers smaller. If our policy gives them the might of Singapore, why is that a bad thing?
The might of Singapore in military sense, I don't really get how important that could be. Now, secondly, on the ambiguous conditions for ASEAN to step in, right? So what I got confused so much between the two speeches on opening half was, so when exactly is ASEAN going to step in? So Daryl first started by saying that whenever it interferes with trade, and whenever it interferes with, say, with human rights and stuff like that, we will step in. Nick came in and said, no, we need a consensus, and without a consensus, we're not going to get in. So are you going to propose a stronger or weaker case? But we forgive them for that because we believe that ultimately the conditions are very ambiguous, and it is very hard for any kind of member state to define what exactly is the conditions that we should be stepping in, right? So we see a few conditions that may happen at the end of the day. The first condition is a very weak scenario where no countries agree on any kind of intervention because it harms their sovereignty. So at the end of the day, no intervention will happen, and the peacekeeping force is just denial. That is the case of African Union, where very little successes are being seen, right? But now, let's see what if that case stands. What if they get a better and stronger case? There's some interventions to happen. What is going to happen is that a lot of countries will try to struggle and get that definition of intervention condition to start with, because they know, for example, that if Vietnam get into a clash with Cambodia over those regional conflicts, right? So peacekeeping force may step in, and they step in either for the interest of Cambodia or Vietnam or for neither of them. Both countries will try to get over all of the power hierarchy in order to define that condition to start with. So you get a lot of countries now trying to struggle over this power and make it a lot harder for any countries to consent. The more important problem is this, that these countries, in order to win this power struggle, are going to use any might they can be, because sovereignty and power security are a lot more important to these countries than a lot of other concerns, say, for example, to Myanmar, right? So what these countries are going to do is that they're going to use economic benefits as bargaining chips. They're going to say we're going to consent or disagree on certain areas unless you interfere or unless you don't interfere. So what you're going to do is you hamper economic trade. And that's what we feel out for opening up. So opening up tell you that they will be less happier for less trade. They tell you they will be less willing to cooperate because they want to use this as bargaining chip. But lastly, what about the consensus? It is so harmful to have a military union. We see the case of NATO, which is already the best case scenario, where it's hugely dominated by USA. But even in that case, it is still better than ASEAN because they started with a consensus that they want to go to the Soviet Union. The problem with ASEAN is that they don't have a consensus right now because there are no mature political mechanisms and because there are lots of struggles already in ASEAN. So what is going to happen is that everyone will try to use these mechanisms for their own good instead for ASEAN's good. But lastly, it also makes it a lot harder for ASEAN to develop in any kind of aspect because these countries would not want ASEAN to become any more stronger, any more independent because it means less sovereignty and less power for them. For these reasons, we believe that even if all the aims that they will talk about that achieved in the end of the day, those costs are going to cost ASEAN in itself. Very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Okay.
Really?
One moment, please, sorry.
Anyone on the toilet? Nobody? I'd like to thank the opposition and invite the last speech from the government to close the debate. Government with.
This debate basically boils down to two questions. Firstly, on the idea of China as a large hegemonic power, what makes China tick? And will a concerted effort by ASEAN to band together make it back down? And if so, what are the implications for the region? The second question is, understanding that ASEAN as a region desperately needs peace and stability for multiple things to work, including the free trade agreements that opposition so loves, what provides it better, ASEAN or the United Nations? So first of all, on China as a hegemon, I'm going to break this down into a few tiers. So my first tier, here's what drives China's internal mechanisms. Opening opposition tells us it's mostly nationalism because people don't want to lose plots of land. Here's what China people would hate to lose even more, a war on like two flanks. Because I thought Justin gave you excellent analysis on why China is going to be likely to back down in this case. China is smart enough to not get involved in a war it knows it can't win because it understands that the way it gains support from the people is by dominating over small patches of territory that no longer have any people who are able to oppose them individually. The problem with this is twofold. First of all, they have to face the might of the United States if ASEAN bands together. Not just from Japan, where the United States already has a power base, but also from ASEAN, where the United States has strong ties to many of the countries within it, such as Singapore, which opening government characterized as being really important militarily. But even more beyond that, we think that China borders many countries within Southeast Asia. We think it shares borders with countries like Vietnam, like Laos, like Cambodia. What this essentially means is that it's going to be really easy for the US if ASEAN bands together and China decides to escalate into a war to come in through these borders and attack China. Understanding the likelihoods of these happening, it is fairly unlikely that China is going to want to continue this and make it a war they cannot win. Second of all, we told you that China considers itself above UN powers, above US powers, simply because it's a large economic power within the region and there is nobody of a similar size and magnitude to take it down. The problems with this, again, no thank you, are some that can be solved by ASEAN integration. How so? We think that first of all, it's unlikely that China is going to continue respecting UN peacekeepers sent in, especially because like China can veto sending in UN peacekeepers whenever it wants. Opening opposition says, well, we must make UN legitimate by allowing them to keep continuing discussions. Look, China is never going to give in on these discussions because it understands the moment it gives in UN discussions, they can bring the whole weight of the UN on them. This already proves that China is kind of scared of regions banding together, of countries banding together to oppose them, and that's the only reason why they're not backing down. We think that allowing countries to band together is indeed an effective way to get China to back down, but here's the third tier. Even if China doesn't back down, at least we provide interim protection. Peacekeepers basically keep the peace. This essentially means it stops violence from escalating within the South China Sea. It ensures that innocent people don't end up are getting killed while debates rage on within the United Nations. We bring to you the idea of Syria and Bashar al-Assad, where while Bashar al-Assad was in the United Nations negotiating, he had his forces keep firing upon people back in Syria. We think that this is actually really important because the presence of peacekeepers will provide a deterrent, no thank you, from escalating the conflict even further, and even beyond that, China risks delegitimizing itself if it continues escalating the conflict, and we think that is something China also wants to avoid. Then we got something from back half about ASEAN-China economic ties. First of all, we tell you that ASEAN-China economic ties aren't really that important in the grand scheme of things because what you need for favorable economic ties and conditions for economies to prosper is essentially peace. We think that peace is a really great thing for the economy. But even beyond that, even if the China economic ties are lost with ASEAN, first of all, they weren't that important to many of them anyway. Let's face it, ASEAN countries are basically out-competing China in terms of cheap labor because America is shifting companies from China to places like Vietnam because labor costs are lower. Because now the currency is still lower because China is already inflating its currency. No thank you. Second of all, we tell you that the free trade agreements that I think China is giving to ASEAN countries is simply appeasement to them. We don't think that keeping to this policy of appeasing China is going to work simply because China wants a lot of things, and the longer people keep giving them these things, the less likely it is to back down. Simply because the more power you give them, the less likelihood there is for people to counter the power in the future. We need to break the cycle right now. Last of all, we don't actually think, no thank you, that China values its ties with ASEAN all that much. Let's face it, China really only values ties with certain countries in ASEAN, and we think that once those countries turn against them, it severely limits their ability to continue trade within ASEAN, which will detriment them as well. Yes?
Your partner's analysis just consisted of a list of countries in Asia. What is the causality from an escalation of South China Sea to India getting in a war with China?
Okay, first of all, India isn't even part of ASEAN. Second of all, my partner's analysis was mostly about how regional conflicts within ASEAN would be greatly helped out by the implementation of UN peacekeepers, which brings me on really nicely to my second point on ASEAN as a region and whether or not UN is better for it. So first of all, on stability, I've already told you a little bit about how implementing peacekeeping policy is essentially an interim policy to ensure that you keep the peace while important discussions go on. I thought Justin also gave you excellent analysis on why it was so important to have discussion about these things. Simply because an ASEAN culture is important, a regional culture is important. Coming from someone from Singapore, I know we have a lot of discussions about national identity and what it actually means to be part of Southeast Asia. We think that even if, as closing government member questioned us, we don't have a consensus on when to deploy troops. The mere discussion of when to deploy troops is especially important for ASEAN to agree what sort of situations you should have within the region, what sort of peace we actually want, how far ASEAN is willing to go to step in for other countries to protect the rights of people. And we think this is going to be really important for ASEAN to develop an ASEAN identity, especially given that ASEAN is not just an economic institution like opposition characterized, but also a cultural institution. Moreover, we think this is going to strengthen economic bonds. We don't buy the analysis that just because some people will be giving slightly more troops than others, this will completely flip the economic bonds. Moreover, we tell you that the places where that are most likely to ask for intervention are also the least likely to break economic ties, simply because the countries which are least stable are the ones that need the most help economically. Furthermore, Justin gave you excellent analysis on bargaining chips. We think that just the mere possibility of sending in troops means that people are more likely to come to an agreement on whether to stop conflicts. Last of all, we think the UN is bad for 3 reasons. First of all, they're really far away. Second of all, it takes a really long time to step in. Last of all, ASEAN people probably want people in their own region to step in because UN people can't understand ASEAN concerns. Because of all this, Justin and I are so proud to propose.
I'd like to thank our whip, and I invite the last speaker to speak. Option whip, please. Here.
Mr. Speaker, I'll break this debate down into two main questions, and I'll be showing you why it's the closing opposition that really takes today's debate, based on understanding that what really is happening with within China, what really is happening within the ASEAN nations themselves, and why at the end of the day, it's harmful to the ASEAN nation in general. Two questions. First, what essentially will China do? And second, what will happen to the ASEAN nations? Now, first of those questions. Because the majority of the opening house came out and told us, was arguing about whether China will back down or not, right? Government telling us that China will back down because there will be pressure and they don't want to lose the economy. Opposition came out and told us that they'd never back down, it's unlikely that they will. The thing about CO and what we came out and told you was this. It doesn't matter whether China backs down or not. The thing about China and what China used to do is to make things unclear and muddy. Like Japan, right? They never really actively engaged with Japan, just saying that this is our land. But they never really did anything that sparked any conflicts, right? They never really did not back down, but they never really stood against Japan actively, right? No, thank you, sir. Well, you can say that. The thing about China is that they won't make anything very clear. But what is certain about China is that they will withdraw support from the ASEAN nation. We think this is problematic because ASEAN nations depend on China alone. Now, thank you, sir. The whip came out and told us this, that ASEAN nations don't depend on China alone, and that this relation isn't important. We say this isn't important to China because China is so big and so powerful, but this is very important to the ASEAN nations. We think, as we know, that China is one of the biggest trade and one of the biggest markets of the ASEAN nations, right? We think that if China withdraws this support, all the economic success, or most of the economic success from ASEAN nations will crumble. We think that at the end of the day, what China will essentially do is to withdraw support and make sure that ASEAN does not rise as much as a threat that the government really tried to portray, right? We think at the end of the day, what China will be doing is to make sure that the ASEAN will remain weak. And instead of backing down or not backing down, they'll make this unclear and make it very difficult for ASEAN nations to become strong. No thanks. But then the extension of closing government was this, that China will no longer be able to bully all these countries all together because somehow they're afraid of countries grouping up together, right? When we take a look at what China really did back in the days, right? When all the countries, or most of the countries in the world already tell them to stop oppressing human rights, right? China still oppresses human rights. What we see today is that China doesn't care about all these countries banding together, especially when these countries are small countries. No, thank you, everyone. Especially when these countries depend on China so much that China will know that they do not dare to do anything that aggravates China because they know that China will withdraw the support. Ladies and gentlemen, no, thank you, sir. At the end of the day, what closing opposition came out and told you was very clear. That China is an important player, a supporter in the ASEAN nations. And by having a peacekeeping troop, what you will do is make China, no thank you sir, perceive ASEAN as a threat and therefore withdraw support from the ASEAN nation. But very well, what happens when, no thank you sir, what happens when China withdraws the support? And at the end of the day, we think that this happens, and what happens to the ASEAN nations will happen on multiple levels. Firstly, within themselves, and secondly, without China's support.
Yeah. Okay, so the Philippines has been deterring China, and it has been effective in terms of like even not fighting them, and we're fine actually. So like, how's that?
Yeah, don't you know that they're fine? The problem is when you group all these countries together, China only perceives that as a much bigger threat. Therefore, they are more likely to withdraw the support from these countries. Because all of them together means that even though all of them are weak, China is more likely to make sure that they grow weaker, right? Secondly, what happens within the ASEAN nations, right? CG came out and told us this. With peacekeeping troops, and essentially the government bench came out and told us this. With peacekeeping troops, somehow there will be peace in the ASEAN nations, right? But obviously, Samuel came out and gave you a very clear question. What happens is, because of the ambiguous conditions, for these countries, for ASEAN to intervene with these peacekeeping troops. What this means is that countries with greater power within the ASEAN nations will try to gain the power to actually be the leader and therefore control these troops, right? Because we understand that within ASEAN there isn't a clear leader. So at the end of the day, what essentially will happen is that since these people, no thank you sir, I'm not taking any more. Since these people are going to fight for power so that they can control these troops to their own advantage, we think it's problematic because at the end of the day, they will be able to use the economy
economy of different countries as their own bargaining chip. For example, reducing trade within the ASEAN nation so that weaker countries are weak and so that they themselves remain relatively stronger. They never really grew strong because their trade was hampered, right? But at the end of the day, they only weakened other countries. But since they have this advantage, they'll be able to use this as a bargaining chip so that they have the power to order the troops around, so that they have the power to make sure that the troops won't be used against themselves, right? This is the extension the SAGU brought to you, never responded by closing government. But then what's more, right? They came out and told us that that will lead to better concessions, better discussions, and people will become more rational in making a decision because there are peacekeeping troops, right? This is exactly what peacekeeping troops are not for. We think by placing a military within ASEAN nations only make it more difficult to make concessions, only make it more difficult to reach consensus. Because what it means is that when countries step down, it means that they show that, oh, I told you I'm not taking anymore. It means that it will be shown that they are the weaker countries. It means that they will be perceived as the weaker countries. What this means is that they are willing to give up their power, which is essentially bad, as Samuel already told you, because this means that the army, because they don't have that much power in discussion, therefore they might have the army used against them, right? Ladies and gentlemen, what we see today is that with peacekeeping troops, because the conditions are so ambiguous, it means that countries are more likely to have internal conflicts within the ASEAN nation, because what they want to do was to control the troops so that they don't have the sovereignty harmed, so that they don't have the economy harmed by these peacekeeping troops. Ladies and gentlemen, what China will do is to harm ASEAN. What ASEAN will do is to harm themselves. ASEAN will, at the end of the day, crumble because of the struggle for power so that they can utilize this as a benefit. China will watch ASEAN crumble because, to their happiness, ASEAN will no longer be a big threat to them according to what the government, something that the government really wanted. But at the end of the day, ASEAN loses, and therefore ASEAN should not have a peacekeeping treaty.
Council Pro Chair can leave the room, please.
Debate.
Outside, guys, outside.
Can I connect this to your